A forest ranger was left for dead, tied to a tree, in the middle of wolf territory. Everyone knows these fierce predators can smell human fear and blood from miles away. But what happened when a pack of gray wolves discovered him would challenge everything we thought we knew about these mysterious creatures. This is a story of survival, instinct, and an encounter that defies all explanations. Get ready for an extraordinary journey that reveals nature's most profound mysteries. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The rope cut into Ranger Jack Harmon's wrists as he struggled against his bindings. 48 hours had passed since the poachers had left him tied to this massive pine deep in the Montana wilderness. His throat burned with thirst, and the November cold had seeped into his bones during the long night. "Help!" he called again, his voice now barely a hoarse whisper after countless unanswered shouts. Miles from any trail, in the heart of Glacier National Park's most remote section, Jack knew his chances of human rescue were virtually non-existent. At 34, Jack had spent 12 years as a park ranger. He knew these mountains better than most, which was why he'd noticed the suspicious vehicle tracks leading off-road. Following them had led him straight to the poachers' camp, where he'd discovered the carcasses of 3 illegally killed elk. The confrontation had been brief. Outnumbered 3-1, Jack had been overpowered, his radio smashed, his emergency locator beacon destroyed. The poachers, fearful of murder charges but unwilling to risk arrest, had chosen what they considered a middle path, leaving him bound in the wilderness to face whatever fate would come. "Someone will eventually find what's left of you," the leader had sneered. "Or maybe the wolves will get you first." The wolves? Jack shivered, not entirely from the cold. This region was home to one of the park's largest and most elusive wolf packs. Normally, wolves avoided humans, but a man unable to move, possibly bleeding from the cuts on his face and wrists, that might be a different story entirely. As the second night of his ordeal approached, Jack took stock of his deteriorating situation. The temperature would drop below freezing again. His fingers had lost feeling hours ago. Dehydration was advancing. Without water soon, he wouldn't last another day. The sound came just as dusk was settling across the forest, a twig snapping, then another. Something was approaching with careful, deliberate steps. Jack held his breath, straining to see in the fading light. A shadow moved between the trees, low to the ground and sleek. Then another. Gray forms materialized from the gathering darkness, their movements fluid and coordinated. Wolves. The lead animal emerged into a patch of fading light, and Jack felt his heart hammer against his ribs. It was massive, with thick silver-gray fur and piercing amber eyes that fixed directly on him. The alpha male of the pack, without question. Behind him, at least 6 others appeared, arranging themselves in a loose semicircle about 20 yards from where Jack was bound. "God," Jack whispered, fear drying what little moisture remained in his mouth. The wolves made no aggressive moves. They simply watched, occasionally communicating with subtle ear movements or quiet whines. Their behavior was unlike anything Jack had witnessed in his years studying wildlife. They seemed to be assessing him. The alpha took a step closer, then another, its nose lifted to catch Jack's scent. Against every survival instinct, Jack remained as still as possible. Running was impossible. Fighting was impossible. All that remained was this strange, silent encounter between predator and helpless prey. When the alpha was just 10 feet away, close enough that Jack could see the individual hairs of its winter coat ruffled by the evening breeze, it did something unexpected. It sat on its haunches, still fixing Jack with that unwavering stare. The behavior was so unwolf-like that Jack wondered if dehydration was causing him to hallucinate. Wolves didn't sit and observe humans like this. They either avoided people entirely or, in the rarest of cases, attacked. This patient observation was outside all known behavioral patterns. Night fell completely, and still the wolves remained, sentinels in the darkness. Jack could see only their eyes now, reflecting what little ambient light remained. Occasionally, one would move, creating a soft rustle in the underbrush, but the alpha never shifted from its position. As consciousness began to slip away, Jack found himself wondering if the wolves were simply waiting for him to die. Or perhaps this strange vigil was something science had never documented before. Wolves trying to understand a human in distress. His last thought before darkness claimed him was oddly peaceful. If this was how his life would end, there was a certain wild justice to it. He had dedicated his life to protecting these mountains and their inhabitants. Now, he would return to them in the most primal way possible. What Jack couldn't know, as he drifted into unconsciousness, was that this encounter was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Jack awoke to the soft glow of dawn filtering through the pines. He was alive, a realization that came with momentary disbelief. The wolves were gone, or so he thought, until a movement to his right caught his attention. The alpha still sat nearby, though now only about 6 feet away. Through the night, it had moved closer, maintaining its strange vigilance. Behind it, 3 other wolves remained, while the rest of the pack had apparently departed. Jack's condition had worsened significantly. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his thoughts becoming disconnected and hazy, clear signs of advancing dehydration. Without water within the next few hours, organ failure would begin. The bindings had cut off circulation to his hands, leaving them numb and useless. The alpha rose suddenly, stretching its powerful body before approaching even closer. Jack tensed, unable to defend himself as the massive predator came within arm's reach. The wolf's breath formed small clouds in the cold morning air as it sniffed Jack's boots, then his legs, working its way up his torso. When it reached his face, Jack closed his eyes, certain that the wolf would sense his weakness and attack. Instead, he felt the rough warmth of the animal's tongue across his cheek, licking at the dried blood from a cut he'd received during the struggle with the poachers. The gesture was not aggressive, but seemed almost exploratory. Was the wolf simply tasting him, determining if he would make suitable prey? Or was this something else, something more complex? The alpha stepped back, then did something extraordinary. It threw back its head and released a howl, not the eerie, wailing sound that carried for miles, but a different vocalization, shorter and more urgent. The other wolves immediately responded, moving in closer. What happened next defied everything Jack thought he knew about wolf behavior. The alpha began pawing at the ground near the base of the tree, digging with intent. One of the other wolves joined in, focusing on the area where the rope was secured around the trunk. "What are you doing?" Jack whispered, his voice a dry rasp. The wolves, of course, didn't respond, but continued their focused activity. After several minutes, Jack felt a slight loosening of the rope that bound him. The wolves had managed to loosen the soil around the base of the tree enough that the rope, which the poachers had secured by wrapping it around the trunk and burying part of it, was beginning to give. It was impossible. Wolves didn't free humans. They didn't understand the concept of bindings or rescue. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Their actions were directly affecting his restraints. With a renewed surge of effort, the alpha dug deeper, its powerful forelegs throwing dirt aside. The rope slackened further. Jack began to work his body in rhythm with the wolves' digging, applying tension when they loosened soil, then relaxing when they paused. Suddenly, with a final heave from Jack and a strong pull from the alpha, who had now gripped part of the rope in its teeth, the binding gave way. Jack fell forward onto his knees, his arms still tied behind him, but no longer secured to the tree. The wolves backed up slightly, watching as Jack struggled to maneuver his numb body. Using the rough bark of the pine, he began working to fray the rope binding his wrists. It was slow, painful work with hands he could barely feel. But after what seemed like hours, the fibers finally snapped. Free at last, Jack collapsed onto the forest floor. The wolves maintained their distance, still observing with that unnerving intelligence. The alpha approached again, sniffing Jack's face before retreating to join its packmates. Jack's freedom brought a new reality into focus. He was still miles from safety, severely dehydrated, and barely able to stand. He had escaped certain death by rope only to face probable death by exposure and dehydration. Unless he found water soon, his liberation would be meaningless. As if sensing his thoughts, the alpha wolf turned and began walking slowly away, then stopped, looking back at Jack with unmistakable intent. The message seemed clear. Follow. Every wildlife management protocol warned against following predators. It was among the most basic survival rules. Yet Jack found himself facing a choice between certain death or trusting these unlikely allies who had already defied everything he thought he knew about wolf behavior. Staggering to his feet, using the tree for support, Jack made his decision. On unsteady legs, he took his first steps toward the waiting wolves. Jack stumbled after the wolves, each step a monumental effort. His legs threatened to buckle beneath him, and the forest seemed to spin intermittently as dehydration clouded his senses. The alpha maintained a steady pace ahead, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Jack was still following. 3 other wolves flanked them at a distance, moving like shadows between the trees. "Where are you taking me?" Jack mumbled, knowing the question was absurd. These were wild animals, not guides, yet their behavior suggested purpose rather than random movement. They had been traveling for perhaps 20 minutes when Jack heard it, the faint sound of running water. The alpha had led him directly toward a stream, which emerged into view as they crested a small rise. Jack fell to his knees at the water's edge, cupping his hands to drink desperately. The cold water was like life itself flowing back into his body. The wolves waited nearby, watching with that same unnerving patience. After slaking his immediate thirst, Jack assessed his situation more clearly. He was alive and free, with access to water. Vast improvements over his condition hours earlier. But he remained deep in the wilderness, without equipment, food, or communications. The temperature would drop severely after nightfall, and in his weakened state, hypothermia would be a near certainty. The alpha approached the stream, drinking beside Jack for a moment before returning to the tree line. Again, it stopped and looked back with that expectant gaze. "Still more to show me?" Jack asked, finding it strangely natural to speak to the wolf despite knowing it couldn't understand his words. Rising unsteadily, Jack followed once more. Their path now moved along the stream for nearly a mile before veering eastward up a gentle slope. As they crested this hill, Jack stopped in astonishment at what lay in the small valley below. A cabin, weathered and clearly long abandoned, but a human structure nonetheless. It appeared to be an old trapper's or prospector's shelter, the kind scattered throughout the park's more remote regions, remnants from the days before it had become protected land. The alpha led directly toward it, showing none of the caution wild wolves typically displayed toward human dwellings. This behavior was so contrary to everything Jack had learned about wolves that he found himself questioning his own sanity. Were these actual wolves or some dehydration-induced hallucination? The cabin's door hung partially open on rusty hinges. Inside, dust covered everything, but the structure remained sound. A small iron stove stood in one corner. A wooden shelf held ancient canned goods. Most importantly, the cabin would provide shelter from the elements, a critical factor in Jack's survival. The alpha stopped at the threshold, unwilling to enter the human structure. It watched as Jack explored the small space, finding a cache of firewood beside the stove, and, miraculously, matches in an old tin on the shelf. Some previous occupant had left emergency supplies. With hands still clumsy from rope burns and returning circulation, Jack managed to light a fire in the stove. Warmth slowly began to fill the cabin. When he returned to the doorway, the alpha still waited outside, though the other wolves had retreated to the edge of the small clearing. Jack sank down, sitting in the doorframe, his body finally giving in to complete exhaustion. "Thank you," he said simply, looking into the wolf's amber eyes. The animal tilted its head slightly, then did something remarkable. It raised its muzzle and released a single short howl before turning to rejoin its pack. Together, the wolves melted back into the forest, leaving Jack alone at the cabin. As darkness fell and the fire's warmth embraced him, Jack tried to make sense of what had transpired. Wolves had no reason to help a human. Their behavior defied scientific explanation, yet he was alive because of them. Before sleep claimed him, Jack made a promise to himself. If he survived to return to civilization, he would dedicate himself to understanding what had happened here. Something extraordinary had occurred in these mountains, something that challenged humanity's understanding of these ancient predators with whom we shared a complex and often violent history. What Jack couldn't know, as exhaustion finally pulled him into deep sleep, was that his encounter with the wolf pack was far from over. The Alpha's actions had set in motion events that would not only ensure Jack's survival, but would eventually challenge wildlife science's fundamental assumptions about wolf cognition and behavior. 3 days later, Jack stood at the edge of the ranger station clearing, barely recognizing the haggard, bearded man reflected in the windows. His ordeal was over. After recovering enough strength at the cabin, he had followed the stream down to a hiking trail, eventually encountering a group of backpackers who helped him reach the station. His story of being left for dead by poachers launched an immediate investigation. What he didn't share, what he couldn't bring himself to report officially, was the role the wolves had played in his survival. Such a claim would be met with disbelief at best, psychiatric evaluation at worst. "You were extremely lucky," Chief Ranger Peterson told him after the debriefing. "Finding that old emergency shelter probably saved your life." Jack nodded, not correcting the assumption that he had stumbled upon the cabin by chance. How could he explain that a wolf pack had deliberately led him to water and shelter? "Take as much time as you need," Peterson continued. "The trauma you experienced, well, no one would blame you if you wanted to transfer to a less remote post." But as Jack recovered over the following weeks, his thoughts continuously returned to the wolves. Far from wanting distance from his experience, he felt drawn back to understand it. The Alpha's intelligent eyes haunted his dreams. Winter settled over Glacier National Park, blanketing the landscape in snow. As soon as he was medically cleared for field duty, Jack requested a research assignment in the remote sector where he'd encountered the wolf pack. "You sure about this?" Peterson asked with concern. "That's the same area where—" "I'm sure," Jack interrupted. "I need to do this." His official mission was to conduct the park's annual wolf population survey in that quadrant. Unofficially, Jack was searching for answers to questions he couldn't even properly formulate. What had motivated the wolves' behavior? Was it a singular anomaly, or evidence of cognitive abilities far beyond what science had documented? Jack established a small research camp near the area where he'd been held captive. Using camera traps and tracking techniques, he began monitoring the local wolf population, identifying the pack that had saved him through their distinctive markings and size. For 2 weeks, he observed them from a distance, documenting normal wolf behaviors, hunting, territorial patrols, pack interactions. There was nothing to suggest these wolves were anything other than typical wild predators. Then, on a frigid January morning, everything changed again. Jack was checking a camera trap when he felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Turning slowly, he found himself face to face with the Alpha, standing just 30 yards away in a small clearing. The wolf showed no aggression, simply regarding Jack with that same steady gaze he remembered. Slowly, Jack knelt in the snow, making himself less threatening while maintaining eye contact. "Hello again," he said softly. For several moments, neither moved. Then the Alpha did something that defied conventional wolf behavior. It deliberately walked closer, stopping just 10 feet from Jack. There it lowered its massive head and body slightly. Not a full submission posture, but something unquestionably deliberate. A recognition. Jack's scientific mind raced through possible explanations. Habituation to humans? Unlikely in this remote region. Food conditioning? He had never fed them. Previous human contact? Possibly, but That wouldn't explain the coordinated rescue behavior. The alpha maintained its position for another moment before turning and trotting back into the forest. Jack remained kneeling in the snow, his heart racing with the implications of what had just occurred. That evening, returning to his camp, Jack found fresh wolf tracks circling his tent. The pack had visited while he was gone, investigating but not disturbing anything. It was as if they were maintaining awareness of his presence, keeping tabs on the human they had saved. In his research journal, Jack began documenting these interactions in a separate section from his official observations. The scientific community would reject such anecdotal evidence outright, yet he couldn't deny what was happening. These wolves recognized him specifically. They were demonstrating behavior that suggested memory, recognition, and decision-making far more complex than wolf research had ever documented. As a scientist, Jack needed evidence beyond his personal experience. The question was how to document interactions so unusual they bordered on unbelievable. The answer would come in an unexpected way, one that would once again put his life in the balance and force him to confront the true nature of the connection he had formed with these remarkable predators. February brought brutal, cold, and heavy snowfall. Jack maintained his research camp, gathering data on wolf movements and behavior patterns. The alpha and its pack continued their occasional visits, always maintaining distance but clearly aware of his presence. One evening, as Jack was comparing track patterns outside his tent, he noticed something unusual, unknown human footprints overlapping the wolf tracks. Someone else had been here, following either Jack or the wolves, perhaps both. The realization sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. The poachers who had left him for dead had never been caught. If they discovered he had survived and was back in their territory, they might return to finish what they had started. Jack radioed his position and concerns to Ranger headquarters, but the response was sobering. A major storm was moving in, grounding all aircraft and making ground access impossible for at least 48 hours. He was on his own. That night, Jack kept his rifle close as wind howled around his small tent. Sleep came in fitful bursts, each sound jolting him to alertness. Near dawn, he drifted into deeper sleep, exhausted from constant vigilance. He awoke to silence, the distinctive, absolute quiet that follows heavy snowfall. Outside, nearly 2 feet of fresh powder had transformed the landscape. Jack was preparing coffee when he saw them. 3 men on snowmobiles approaching from the west. Even at a distance, he recognized the lead rider's hulking frame. The poachers had returned. Jack's options were limited. The deep snow made quick escape impossible on foot. His snowshoes would leave obvious tracks. Fighting was a last resort against 3 armed men. His best option was to evade, circle back to where he'd cached an emergency satellite phone, and call for immediate evacuation. Moving quickly, Jack packed essential survival gear and his research documentation. He strapped on snowshoes and had just entered the tree line when the first snowmobile roared into his camp. "I know you're out there, Ranger," the leader's voice carried across the snow. "Thought the wolves would get you, but here you are. Won't make the same mistake twice." Jack pushed deeper into the forest, using the trees for cover. The snowmobiles couldn't follow through the dense woods, giving him a temporary advantage. If he could reach the ridge 2 miles east, he might access his emergency cache and call for help. He had covered perhaps half that distance when he heard them. The poachers had abandoned their vehicles and were following on foot, tracking his snowshoe prints. Jack increased his pace, but the deep snow made movement exhausting. Cresting a small rise, Jack paused to catch his breath and felt his blood freeze. Ahead, blocking his path to the ridge, was a steep ravine he hadn't anticipated. The storm had obscured landmarks, and he'd veered off course. Backtracking wasn't an option with the poachers closing in. As Jack considered his dwindling options, movement caught his eye. On the opposite side of the ravine, a large gray form emerged from the trees. The alpha wolf. It stood watching, then moved along the ravine edge before disappearing into the forest. Without fully understanding why, Jack followed the wolf's path along the ravine. After 200 yards, he discovered what the Alpha had seemingly been showing him: a fallen tree creating a natural bridge across the chasm. Jack crossed carefully, then continued eastward through increasingly difficult terrain. His pursuers would eventually find the same crossing, but he had gained precious time. The ridge was now visible through the trees ahead. He had nearly reached his destination when a gunshot cracked through the winter air. Pain exploded in Jack's left shoulder, spinning him into the snow. The poachers had spotted him and fired from the tree line behind. Clutching his bleeding shoulder, Jack struggled to his feet and staggered forward. The satellite phone cache was just ahead, his last hope for survival. Behind him, he heard the poachers' voices, closing in for what they intended to be the final confrontation. Jack reached the rocky outcropping where he'd hidden the emergency cache. As he fumbled with the container using his good arm, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. Wolves. Not just the Alpha, but the entire pack, emerging silently from the forest around him. 8 powerful predators materializing like gray shadows against the white snow. For an instant, Jack feared they had been drawn by the scent of his blood, arriving to claim wounded prey. But their attention wasn't focused on him. The wolves moved past Jack, positioning themselves between him and the approaching poachers, who were now visible at the edge of the small clearing. The lead poacher stopped abruptly, raising his rifle when he spotted the wolf pack. "What the hell?" The Alpha stepped forward, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from deep in its chest. Behind it, the pack spread into an attack formation Jack had only read about but never witnessed. A coordinated hunting pattern designed to bring down dangerous prey. What happened next would be debated by wildlife biologists for years to come. The wolves launched a coordinated action that could only be described as defensive protection of Jack. They advanced on the poachers not as a chaotic mob, but as a tactical unit, forcing the men to retreat in panic toward the ravine. Jack, fighting to remain conscious through blood loss and pain, managed to retrieve and activate the emergency beacon. His last memory before darkness claimed him was of the Alpha returning to stand guard beside him as the sound of the poachers' retreat faded into the distance. Jack awoke in a hospital bed 3 days later. The Park Service helicopter had reached him just in time, guided by his emergency beacon. The official report stated he had been shot by poachers, the same men who had previously left him for dead. What the report didn't mention were the wolf tracks found surrounding his unconscious form in a protective circle, or how the rescue team had observed wolves watching from the tree line as they loaded Jack into the helicopter. Chief Ranger Peterson sat beside Jack's hospital bed, reviewing his statement. "The poachers have been apprehended," he informed Jack. "They were found lost and half frozen near the eastern boundary. They're claiming they were chased by wolves." Jack nodded, unsurprised. "There's something else," Peterson continued, looking uncomfortable. "The wildlife research team analyzing your observation data has found anomalies. The movement patterns of the wolf pack you were studying show unusual territorial behaviors. Specifically, they appear to have established a protective perimeter around your research camp." "I know," Jack replied simply. Peterson studied him carefully. "There are also your personal journals, the incidents you described, the rescue, the guidance to water and shelter, the apparent recognition behaviors. Under normal circumstances, I'd recommend psychological evaluation for a ranger reporting such things." "But," Jack prompted. "But we found something when processing evidence from the poachers' camp." Peterson pulled out his phone and showed Jack a photo. They had trail cameras set up. This was captured the day you were shot. The image showed Jack fallen in the snow, blood visible on his shoulder. Standing over him was the Alpha wolf, its body positioned between Jack and the camera angle. Behind them, the rest of the pack was clearly forming a protective formation. "This doesn't happen, Jack," Peterson said quietly. "Wolves don't protect humans. It contradicts everything we know about wolf behavior." "Maybe we don't know as much as we think," Jack suggested. In the weeks that followed, as Jack recovered, the story of the guardian wolves leaked to the media despite the Park Service's attempts to maintain scientific caution. Wildlife researchers descended on Glacier, hoping to document the unprecedented behavior. The wolves, however, had vanished from their usual territory, moving deeper into the park's most inaccessible regions, as if they understood the attention they had attracted and chose to avoid it. 6 months later, fully recovered, Jack stood on a remote ridge overlooking the valley where his extraordinary experience had begun. He had returned not as an official researcher this time, but simply as a man seeking to understand an encounter that had changed his perspective forever. As the sunset painted the mountains in gold and crimson, a familiar sound reached him. A wolf howl, distinctive and unmistakable. The Alpha's call. At the valley's edge, the pack appeared, led by their silver-gray commander. They made no approach, maintaining their wild distance. But the Alpha's gaze found Jack on his ridge, and in that connected moment, something passed between them that transcended scientific explanation. Jack had spent his career believing he understood the natural world through the lens of science and data. Now he recognized a humbling truth, that perhaps the most profound aspects of nature existed in spaces beyond our current understanding. The wolves of Glacier had not just saved his life, they had challenged humanity's perception of the divide between human and wild. Their actions suggested cognition, decision-making, and perhaps even ethical choice that science had never attributed to non-human species. As darkness fell and the wolf pack melted back into the wilderness that was their true home, Jack knew he would never fully understand why they had chosen to intervene in a human life. Perhaps that mystery was itself the most valuable outcome of his ordeal. The recognition that the natural world still held wonders beyond our comprehension. What remained certain was that somewhere in these mountains, a wolf pack moved through the wild with knowledge of a human they had chosen to save. And somewhere in human society, a man now moved with the knowledge that the boundaries between species might be far more permeable than humanity had ever imagined. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who loves inspiring stories about the incredible connections that can form between humans and wildlife. Help us spread the message that the natural world still holds mysteries waiting to be discovered.